What is happening, guys? Steve Mayeda here, and this is an Austin Men's Development presentation. And these are presentations which are meant for you to truly better yourself as a man. And part of this is being able to share a perspective that is based on life experience, that's also based on coaching experience that works for men. I hate BS. I hate it when guys promote a message that does not work. I've been doing this since 2006. And literally worked with thousands upon thousands of men help live a better life. And there's a certain way to it. So what we're going to actually talk about here is when we as men are wronged by women. And we hear this over and over and over again in terms of relationships, like when we get divorced, when we get cheated on, when we get lied to, when all these different things happen in the sense of us being a man. You know, a woman can harm us. Now, the title of this, and of course you can download all the slides to it, as well as find out about our different groups and so on that we'll talk about throughout this, our free ones, our paid ones, and just how to better yourself in different free resources. The free stuff linked down below. But feel free definitely to follow along by downloading the slides and so on. It'll make things a little bit easier because the slides, there's a lot of different notes that I wrote for myself to remember, but they may not all be covered in the production that we do here today. So we're actually doing this on December 15th, live on a TSL online call. And the title of this is The Dark Side, Hell Hath No Fury. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. We know that. And then the subtitle to it is how we become strong when experience extreme trauma from women, when experiencing extreme trauma from women. This is very important because what makes us strong men is pain. And so we want to get into this next slide here when it says, without pain, you cannot have strength. Without pain, you cannot have worth. Better yet, self-worth. Without pain, you cannot know you. And see, all of that is going to be good about you in life is dependent upon how you feel, see, and live through your pain. In life, in your life, in human history, we've always had trauma. We've never been shorted of that phenomenon of having pain that we cannot understand, that we cannot fathom, that is tremendously confusing and acts us to act and react all over the place. But throughout human history, that's always been there. So what we're going to cover today in this presentation is we're going to cover trauma and abuse in relationships, primarily trauma and abuse from women to men, which is a unique thing, but there's a very different perspective on it. We're going to look at the characteristics of trauma. We're going to look at victimhood. We're also going to look at strength. How do we become better men from this? If we don't become better men from this, then we've truly lost. If we just become men that are angry and blaming and confused, we're only going to get to a point where we just don't progress. So who am I? I'm Steve Mayeda. I've been a men's coach since 2006. I've worked constantly with men, and it's the only thing that I've done that whole entire time. And man, I've helped a lot of men achieve their best selves. Now, I specialize in dating and sex-related issues and addiction of all types issues. And you'll probably hear in this a lot of addiction correlations with drugs and traumas that come up with that, because that's a real wealth of information of how we could better ourselves. Now, also, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a mental health professional. And in some ways, I don't want to be, because for myself as a coach, I have a different relationship with the men that I work with. You know, I don't have to worry about privacy issues and so on. And that, you know, literally in our groups, we can heal and talk about anything. Whereas a lot of times with a psychotherapist or psychologist, there might be laws of certain things you can disclose or can't, or things that I would have to report. Now, those, of course, are done with great intention and great thought to protect others and protect harm and so on. But I feel to work inside a different boundary is very good. Now, also, what I'm talking about here and the different groups that I present are not replacing psychotherapy or mental health. Please seek professionals. The different advice I give in the groups that I have is not meant to replace legal advice. please seek professionals in all those different areas. It's not either or. Just because you may like something that I say or dislike something that I say does not mean that it needs to blur the lines of all these different things. And we'll get into this a little bit in the next slide coming up. So one of the things that we have here is we have a wealth of knowledge that I'm going to share to you that covers many, many, many different takes that different men that I've worked with have experienced. And when we talk about that, it's a huge volume of men that have experienced pain and trauma from women that's in the thousands. But not only just that, of men who've really healed themselves and, in my opinion, become better men. And we'll define exactly what that means of better men. But men that are strong, men that don't blame, that men's self-worth and opinion of themselves and their expression out in the world that they make and create is not dependent upon suppressing anybody else. It's not dependent upon controlling anybody else or having power over anybody else, but only power over themselves. And this is a very, very unique, sadly unique, but very beneficial way to express yourself in life. So the other thing about this is the purpose of this presentation. And there's a saying that we have within our groups that says, nature does not need science, but man needs science in order to understand nature. Now, when we get all through this, I work a non-traditional approach of, working with men, and it has a very good result. But at the same time, I respect absolutely what psychology, what neuroscience, what different forms of thought that work towards, working with other people, in this case, trauma, not just men in trauma, have found and discovered. It's not about either or, it's about communicating more. And when it comes to the highest level of, let's say, the most qualified person, when it comes to these things like trauma, victimhood, healing from it, and so on, even in those situations, we're just scratching the surface of what we know about healing the mind. Now, this is a very complex thing, and, trauma has created different reactions and responses in society as our populations get denser, and in modern culture we have new problems. Like I said, things like trauma have been around for a long time. But my goal in this is to create a bigger dialogue, not to create an either or. So if you disagree with me, that's fine. What I don't like is when we polarize. If I disagree with you, you disagree with me. Our job is to create a dialogue of what works. I have a tremendous volume of men where we've healed and we've worked through stuff, but there could be massive holes. There definitely are holes in what I do. I want to improve that, but not by playing either or between different ideologies of, let's say, neuroscience. This comes up all the time in addiction because there's great neuroscience evidence about addiction. But when we get to therapeutic groups that actually heal guys and have success with, drug addicts recovering and living a better life, it almost discounts that. And it shouldn't. These groups should talk and learn how to work together. So that's really the goal in this. And again, just to reemphasize this, nature does not need science. Man needs science to understand nature. Our definitions that are man-made that we put on this to be able to work through it, and perhaps certain absolutes that I see that are dependent for my coaching to get the results that I need, can be broken, and most likely should need to be broken as we progress with these different ideas and thoughts. So let's get into this topic. As a men's coach who specializes on dating, sex-related issues, as well as addiction, trauma, I talk about that a lot. We get men who not a day goes by, and especially more intensely in the last 5 years, I get somebody that says, my ex was a narcissist. My ex has borderline personality disorder. They have, their sociopathic tendencies. I read the book, The Sociopath Next Door. This person definitely is this. I read an article about psychopathy. This person's a psychopath. And I get this over and over again. And, hey, I've dated plenty of people where I have similar problems. I've voiced the same thing myself. And one of the things that's so important when it comes down to all of this is that this is a phenomenon and a discussion that we as men need to have, but we need to have it in completion to the end of what makes a good man, a great man. Okay. And not a man that gets caught up in blame, not a man that gets caught up in overanalyzing something or defining somebody else or making excuses for different poor points in their life. Again, throughout life, you're going to have many problems. You're going to have many issues there are things which are going to be unfair that you're going to get slammed with. That's a guarantee. And in fact, your strength, you being able to be a great person, is dependent upon that. So we as men also have to learn to deal with that and find our strength within it. So for years, I've had these same stories myself. Okay. And it got worse and worse until I changed me. Okay. But it's not as simple as just that. You know, for myself, I have known I've dated people that are crazy and I've analyzed their behavior and so on, but they've also done that with me. So just to be clear, women that I've dated have said, oh my God, Steve is a psychopath, or Steve is a sociopath, or Steve is a crazy person, or Steve is a narcissist. And this obsession with proving their point about me was so key. Now, some of those girls were also girls that I said were, you know, that I said that had a problem too, or recognized that they possibly may have a problem. Some weren't. But the thing is that this happened. This happened, and it was such a great phenomenon and very important to that person to prove that they dated somebody like myself. It was just so, you know, oh geez, you know, this, I can't believe that I dated this person. It's not my fault. You know, they so convincingly lied. And I noticed I was saying the same thing. And it just it happened so much that I started to notice, man, what the hell's going on? Now, also in all of this, I worked on myself devoutly. Okay, so myself, somebody who has had problems with addiction, who's gotten clean, who worked, intensely on who I was as a person. And because of that, I was able to gain a deeper and deeper perspective. Now, also because of that, I saw, people who have drug problems tend to have poor relationships. I saw people who also had poor relationships like mine. And so from an outside perspective, you could see how some of these problems developed and solved and resolved, and just this pattern that kept coming up. And so one of the most unhealthy things that I'd done in this whole situation that took me years, literally years to stop, was how I overanalyzed the other person. Now, as we're going to see in this presentation, that this is a common thing, and it's a part of the whole process, is that we should be curious about why these patterns are happening in our lives, or analyzing different people's issues and so on. But if we don't move past that at a certain point, it becomes highly dysfunctional, which a lot of people, including myself, have gotten trapped in. And again, this took me years to get past. And what's crazy is now speaking to you now at the end of 2018, it's been years since I've had these thoughts. I mean, we're talking a long time since I've been this sort of person, and thankfully I've been able to work with and coach men to get out of this. Okay. So if you want to be your best, your personal best, which is the goal of every single man out there, you cannot be a victim. But if you have been abused, if you've been traumatized, you also have to start as a victim. It's very important. So if you want to be your best, you cannot be a victim. But if you want to move past that, you have to recognize and start that you are one, if you've been abused. And so what we have to go through now is this process of, if we've experienced trauma, if we have experienced extreme abuse or manipulation and so on from women, we have to learn how to feel that pain, feel that hurt, be a victim, recognize that, move past that, and transition into a better part of ourselves. Literally, abuse, torture, trauma, whatever you want to call it, that happens in our life, if we can get a grasp on it, if we can handle it in the right way, it is a doorway to a level of personal excellence that you wouldn't have had access to without that trauma. And like I said, that trauma has always existed in man's history. Okay, so let's get to this. So what do women do? How do women attack men? This is very common that this happens. Women attack men all the time. We hear about it. They lie, they cheat, they manipulate, they humiliate, they degrade, they destroy. We always hear divorce, rape. The courts are more in favor of women and so on. Women hurt men in very unique ways. They really cause a level of abuse or pain in a different way than a man would. Okay, in some ways it's more psychologically creative. In some ways, it digs into pain that much deeper. And it really demoralizes and humiliates in a very different way that many men can relate with. And why do women do this? So when we look at the results of this, we look and we see that this must mean women are bad. Women have different psychological predispositions and motivations that are different than men that are just crazy. More women, when we look at it, stuff like borderline personality disorder, which is a very, very, man, if you know people who are borderline and have truly been diagnosed that way, not just you looking online and making the assessment for yourself, but have been diagnosed that and entered into, psychiatric or psychological treatment or therapy specifically designed for borderline people, how dangerous and crazy that could be. So it's really an intense disorder. More women might be psychopathic and so on, but it is actually true that very few men are borderline. So, oh my God, women are crazy. When we look at these results, we look at that. And when we look at those results, that women have more psychological problems and they attack men psychologically. And we can buy into that story when we can take that and match that information in with our lives. We don't need to look any deeper. We could, but we can assess that we're in danger and we need to avoid women, or very, very carefully and studied and methodically control them. This could be a very, very easy result to get from this. But again, I see men go down this road and I see them get worse. And we'll talk about this very, very specifically as this goes on. But myself, coming from the pickup artist community, and of course, I've broadened my horizons much further, I saw how much that damaged men. Now, when I see new communities such as the Red Pill or MGTOW or incels and so on, and it gets pretty extreme, but in those ideologies, even with the pickup artists, the PUA ideology, somebody who stays in that ideology, I rarely see them have a functioning life and functioning relationships with women. And that could be hard to define, but let's make this a little bit more specific. And like I said, we'll get into this a little bit more. Somebody who's bought into those ideologies, who's experienced trauma in their life, I know zero of them who have gotten better if they stay in that ideology. Now, I don't know a lot of people who are involved in MGTOW personally. I see the online presence and I see them get mad at me. I don't know people personally who are incels. I see the online presence. I know a few people who are involved in the Red Pill and so on. I know a ton of people who've been involved in the pickup artist scene, a huge amount. And people who stay in that ideology, as well as the Red Pill people that I know that have experienced trauma, do not recover from it. And let me get more specific on what I mean by that and do not recover from it. They don't have relationships. Let's say this. If they have relationships, they are completely founded upon fearing that other person and controlling that other person. Limiting choice, limiting expression, and putting heavy definitions and rules upon people so they don't get hurt. That is astounding. And these groups that are created by men who want to live their best selves, that is really the primary purpose of a lot of it. Pick up, okay, get laid and all this stuff, but it is tied into being your best self. We see people still ending up dysfunctional, relying on control and power in order to have expression in their lives. That is astounding, and that is terrible. Yet, if you go into other groups, and there's great groups other than mine, if this doesn't resonate with you, that's fine. But if you look at, I mentioned them in the PDFs, and I'm sorry if I'm leaving some of the good guys out, but if you look at guys like David Tien, or if you look at guys like Hans Komain, completely different than me, but great coaches produce great results with great people. My groups, you literally have over 100 guys who can tell you about how they worked out of trauma, pain, a lot of that from women, but sometimes other things, and were able to live a good life and become stronger from it right there in front of you, talking to you face to face or in a conversation. And it's not dependent upon power or control of somebody else. So I just wanted to put this up here. This is a list of some words and definitions. Words and definitions. We love words and definitions. Yet so many of us use words and definitions without really studying the definition and looking how that definition may fit for our own lives. So here we have manipulation, and it says the action of manipulating something in a skillful manner. It also says the action of manipulating somebody in a clever or unscrupulous way. I always love definitions that use their own definitions in it. These all came from Google. Psychopath, a person who suffers a chronic mental disorder with abnormal or violent social behavior. Now, I'll tell you this from studying what a psychopath is. There's much more to this definition that could be added to it. Also, a sociopath, a person with a personality disorder manifesting itself in an extreme antisocial attitudes and behaviors and lack of consciousness and a lack of conscience. Can't talk or read for that matter. So narcissist, a person who has an excessive interest or an admiration of themselves. Machiavellian, another one that we hear, cunning, scheming, and unscrupulous, especially in politics or advancing one's career. Now, it's interesting. We look at these definitions. We use them all the time, but rarely do we study them absent from our pain. And what I mean by that is we rarely study these definitions and what they would mean outside of our lives. We're almost studying these definitions because they fit within our lives. And one thing we know about just scientific studies or double-blind studies and so on, when we're emotionally invested in a certain outcome, we tend to be biased in those outcomes. And it's just amazing how people use this. Like I said, in watching the repetition of how these get used and so on, in just the years and years of experience that I have with men, as well as in the addiction fields, it's pretty wild how much they get misused and how much they derive from pain, the pain that we feel. Okay, so trauma. Let's look at this. Another definition. So trauma, a deeply distressing and disturbing experience. And of course, we're going to talk about this a lot. And then also abuse, something to bad effect or for bad purpose misuse, or to treat a person or an animal with cruelty or violence, especially regularly or repeatedly. This is what we really want to study first, is trauma and abuse. Because trauma and abuse is, one, the result of all those previous definitions of somebody who's Machiavellian or psychopath or whatever, but also because we have felt trauma and abuse. And we're going to get deep on this because we felt it. We look for the need for those definitions, which, hey, I'm right there with you. We should be defining them. But we do need to heal in a different way. All right. So let's look at this. The way that men abuse and the way that women abuse. I want you to understand this because, there's some parallels here, yet there's such a distinction and it's so interesting. And the first time I ever noticed this was when I looked at abuse when it comes from women, from women, their mothers to their sons. It was so different and in some ways amazingly psychologically creative. Just, it took things on a different level of shame. And it was just so fascinating why it was so different. Now, it was more rare or reported less, but it was just so much deeper. Some examples of this would encourage like the whole family to humiliate or abuse a child, or it was more like traditional. Whereas a man, it would be more private and direct, more rely on violence and physicality and so on, or just direct sex. But with women, there was choice involved and thought and this heavy process of stuff. And so the way that men generally are abusive is physically. Okay. Now, characteristics of this abuse might be that it's intimidating, that it's humiliating, that it involves power, that it involves manipulation, that it does involve destruction, but it involves a psychological component, of course, but generally it's physical. Okay. Now it could break from that. Absolutely. And I've been around, and some of the rehab work that I've done, I've just heard insane things that men have done that it just blows my mind that this is possible when it comes to abuse. The way that women abuse is it tends to be more psychological. Okay. Now, this could be gossip. This could be attacking reputations. This could be, truly mentally breaking somebody without the tools of physicality, really working for them. So it might involve, spanking or hitting with a coat hanger and so on. Or if you're familiar with, the movie Mommy Dearest, but it went a step further. It wasn't just I'm hitting you with this coat hanger because of, I'm a bad person. It's because you made me do it. In the instilling of that idea, or if she had ruined the rose bushes or ruined a rose bush, the mom then destroyed the rest of the rose bushes and, blamed her for it. So these types of things that just went a little bit deeper. Now, when we see this with hell hath no fury like a woman scorned in a divorce setting, what does a woman do? What is she going to attack you with? A lot of times she attacks you with money, with your reputation. If she sees an exploitation in the court system, she's going to take it and run with it. But so much of it has to do with you being defeated as a man psychologically. No longer does your power, does your stature, do the things that made you proud, which might be money or creation, your family, your power, your physicality. This now is robbed from you and taken away. So the main point of all of this is women and men can be abusive in different ways, yet they follow the same characteristics. There's power over, there's humiliation, there's these different components and characteristics that stay the same, but they're enacted differently. One of the things with this is that many times do we see women as different because of this. So by this, we could argue that women have more psychological disorders than men, and a lot of that is true. Now, does that mean they have to be abusive in this way? It might mean that they come out abusive in that way. It might mean that when they're put under certain pressure and they do act in abusive ways, that this sort of mental disorder may come up, or it may not be a mental disorder. It might be the differences of men and women, but women could say the same things about men. And this is what's interesting is women can make the argument that men are brute. They don't think. And we hear this. This is the amazing thing. What we hear from men's rights groups and we hear from hardcore feminist groups is the same anthem, the same characteristics, the same categorization that is supposed to somehow sway us and change our behavior. And really for what? I mean, a lot of this is the pain speaking. But men are brute, men are rapists, they're dogs, they catcall, they objectify women, all these different things. But that's man's expression. Now, is man innately that way? Or when he's put under pressure, does he act that way? Is when he is put under pressure, do these disorders come up? What is it? But we can't have that dialogue. We can't figure that out when we categorize and pigeonhole. And so how much we limit ourselves by holding on to those titles are key. How much we limit ourselves by defining the definitions that we saw in the previous slides based on our pain and not truly studying it in a way that's detached from us. We misuse the word and we misuse the solution. We don't find it. In some ways, I want to say, thankfully, I had all the problems I had, but also the resources of men to work with, drug addicts to work with, to see just these repeat patterns that you just couldn't ignore. And again, hopefully we can build that dialogue more. Okay, so let's get into this, understanding abuse and the different feelings. This is important for you guys to understand and for your own healing process if you've had these things. And what this is how one feels when they're being abused is going to be different than how one may talk about it for the first time after being abused. All right? Is going to also feel different from how one perceives it or remembers it. And also how somebody's going to act when they know that society thinks it is wrong or the culture that they're talking to may think about it in a certain way. And so let's look at this. Like when we're abused, a lot of times we feel bad, obviously. It doesn't feel good. If we don't understand it, we're confused. When it gets truly traumatizing, it is unending terror. I don't know if you guys have ever been in that. But if you're being assaulted, if you're being beaten, if you're being sexually assaulted, if you're under massive duress and war or something like that, it seems like it's never going to end, true panic. Just me talking about that right now, it accesses certain feelings that are very intense. There might even be a certain level of acceptance while we're going through abuse. But that sort of pain, that sort of trauma that we're feeling has a unique feeling while it's happening. That is also going to be different from how we express it to somebody. So a lot of people don't express it, but you get this a lot with different PTSD circles and so on, is the first time they're able to actually express what it was like. And I just remember talking to a couple of my friends who had been in a circle, a PTSD circle that had to do with war. And what they were talking about was what most people in society would just be like horrified about. But they were able to laugh. They were able to joke about it. They were able to cry about it. They were able to hurt about it. And it just seemed like they all understood, which was very comforting. But that was different from how they felt it. Just as if it's the first time you're coming out about, oh my God, I was abused sexually by my father or mother or uncle or aunt or whatever it is, we're going to share that much differently. And we're also going to share that much differently from how we perceive it, how we remember it. Okay, so even before we share it with somebody, how we perceive it is we're constantly trying to figure it out and understand it and define certain things and hide it and say that and have this internal argument of how that doesn't affect me or does affect me and so on. But then when we share it with somebody, we might perceive it a different way. You know, it might be freeing in a certain sense, but also a war or a real fight of going, no, that didn't affect me. I'm not messed up because of it, or I am, or different levels of denial could come out. So we have to understand that that's unique as well. Okay, where we get to a lot of points now is because we have the internet, which does so many great things. Would we want a world without it? Of course not. But we have a lot of people who we can reach out to who say what we should feel like when we have been abused. Even you could say that this video is that, which is not meaning to be. You should find out your own. You're going to have to find out what it means on your own and work through it on your own so that you can gain your strength, because it's your strength. So when we get into this, when we get into this sort of abuse that we've had, we're going to feel it in one way when we're having it that is very hard to interpret. So they're feelings that we've never had before. We're also going to feel it in one way when we talk about it, which is also very hard to articulate. It's very, very difficult. We can't put our finger on it. We only feel trauma so much. Even if it's only once a month, it's too hard to find points of references to articulate it. When we perceive it and remember it, whether it's before or after we've shared about it with somebody, it's also a thing which is very difficult to articulate. And then when we put it out there in the world where we have a definition of what we're supposed to feel, that agree upon how we've been wronged and so on, we have different characteristics and feelings. Like I was saying, with all of these, there's some things that we could predict of how we're going to feel. You know, a lot of times when we remember back to it, we feel hateful, vindictive, resentful, and so on. We're not feeling that while the abuse is done. But when we have a group or a culture of people supporting what we feel, the resentment, the rage, the need for vengeance becomes much, much more. The ability to accept, to understand, to forgive. And maybe you don't need to do any of those things, but it becomes impossible to think those things. And we get stuck in this culture of blame, of needing to prove a point, needing to prove people wrong, searching for justice, searching for causes, and so on, that are almost never ending, come from when we deal with our feelings of abuse in a system or a culture of people where, they agree we've been wronged. Happens over and over again. And so at this point, let's say we've been abused. We've been abused from a woman who divorce rapes us. We've been abused by somebody who's trashed our reputation. Or maybe we've been abused in another way. We got beaten or hurt or sexually assaulted. These are all bad things. And of course, by any of this, I'm absolutely saying there are victims. And as a victim, there's certain responsibilities that you're going to have to learn. But if you are a victim, you need to become a victim. And this is a good thing. This is a part of a process where we start to realize that we have been wronged and there is a problem. And in all of that, we need to understand that this is not necessarily a bad thing. Even though I'm saying if you want to be a strong man, if you want to be a strong person, if you want to be your best, you cannot be a victim, but you have to start as a victim. You have to start there. You have to recognize it and see that there's a long process that is not quick, that will take a lot of work. But again, nobody was deprived this in all of human history. We've had trauma and terror be a huge part of it. But in all of this, that however we overcome that, however we deal with it, however we come to terms with it, is going to be something which is a gift to us. It's going to give us the ability to be great. Very, very important. Okay, so here we talk about like how people tell the story of abuse. All right. And so obviously being a victim is a terrible thing, but but it comes with baggage that we need to be aware of. And when we share abuse, oftentimes it builds opinions and drama that we need. It builds ideas of vengeance, of justice, of knowing more about it so that we can never have it happen again, of being cautious. These are all things that trauma gives us, that pain, that intense moments, that humiliation, shame, whatever gives us. It allows us as men and human beings to study what had happened and to never let that happen again. And not only to never let that happen again to us, but to other people. Now, even though this is a part of the process that you might be experiencing, if you're in it, you can't fight it. You got to let yourself do it. It's really a crazy thing. We almost have no control over it. We have to allow this to ride out or do it in a safe space in order to have it move on and pass to the next part. And this part is kind of a tough pill to swallow. And I say that because what we're going to break down here is I want to break down this pattern of abuse and pattern of victimization that comes in. But to accept this, to understand it, is very difficult because it's counterintuitive to what we might think. Now, I also want to make a point to this. Human beings have always had trauma in the history of human beings. It's worse than what we probably have today. You know, our loved ones dying, missing limbs, or having just terrible things happen. Just things being ripped apart. But we also had a different society and culture dealing with it. And you hear people talk about this a lot. And again, all very theoretical. We can study current groups anthropologically now, but you know, groups that think the opposite of me use these same examples of evolution and so on. But we had a tighter knit group of people. And when we have tighter knit groups of people and communities that are either formulated by a religion here in the United States or in smaller communities outside of the United States where they have love and ability to express, even though there are disorders or abuse or traumas that happen, you get a different result of how that trauma is dealt with. Because we have this crazy culture that's wild and that we're not going to give up. The internet's great. Going to the store and getting food is great. You know, having access to so many different things is great, but it does build different pressures that we need to be aware of. In this case, we are going to have to take a different protocol to how to get out of that pain. You know, we're using man-made solutions to man-made problems. Very important to understand with a baseline of what we evolved to be, right? Of what our nature is, so to speak. The pattern of abuse and the pattern in the story of being a victim is tough to understand. So when we're in pain, we want to get out of pain. We run, we seek safety. Okay. We categorize that pain. We try and understand it. We never want to repeat it again. Okay. We seek traits that might be the opposite of that pain. So as simple as this is like if we get burned, we seek something cold, but also we understand that fire may do that or certain hot things do that. And we want to create a certain distance, a system, a fireplace. We want to understand how to be able to live in harmony with it. And one of the interesting things here is especially something like fire, which is very dangerous, we learn to live with, you know, so that we could cook meat and use it as a tool, and perhaps our own digestive system was made for that. But there could have been other primates or hominids or so on, or whatever we evolved before us that were afraid of fire, that stayed as apes. And we also as apes, but became something else because we could deal with playing with fire, so to speak. It's interesting. I always want to bring this up because when you hear the guys who are involved in MGTOW or the men go their own way groups, they talk about women being so dangerous. But part of the characteristic, the fundamental, they always say it's science, but part of the fundamental need for our evolution was to be able to work with women. If we don't work with fire, we die out. We can't. We need to eat in a certain way. Or I guess we don't, vegans have proved that that's not necessarily necessary. But when it comes to this sort of way of life, we see to deny it. In any case, we see what causes pain. We try and control it. And then we try and live in a different way, right? What's interesting when it comes to emotional things like women or relationships or sex or behavioral things like perhaps addiction is that when we try that new way of doing things, putting the cage around the fire, distancing ourselves from cocaine, distancing ourselves from heroin, distancing ourselves from women who are crazy, what happens is we then create or we enter into a whole new set of challenges that were attached to that. So women are connected to our emotions. If you're a drug addict and have a habit of doing cocaine over and over again, then doing that drug, well, man, there's so many emotions and an ecosystem of who you are is tied into it, whether you think it or not, that becomes a big problem. There's a reason why you chose that woman. There's a reason why you did that drug. There's a reason why you continue to do that drug and why you liked it, why you liked that woman. But there's also a reason why that woman liked you, why that drug fit with you, why all those things work together, that when you take it away and you build boundaries and you build rules and you say you're not going to do something, it builds a whole nother set of frustrations where a lot of people go back to it and they get abused again. Cocaine is bad. I am not bad. It is bad. And eventually you do it so much you just think you're bad and you're bad without it. And it gets worse and worse. Women are bad. I keep going back to it. Oh, she is bad. She is bad. She is bad. Oh, you know what? I can never go back to it because I can never trust them, or I have to heavily control them. To make this point and to swallow this pill, so to speak, we're going to look at a female example of abuse. And I always like doing this because we're so familiar with it. So I was talking with some of the guys on our calls and we were talking about I was talking about how I knew a lot of girls who were dancers, strippers, and they always have a lot of problems with men. But then some of the other guys were talking about, this isn't just dancers. This is girls that I know that don't have volatile jobs where, it has women with a lot of problems. So a woman says she dates a man that cheats, or a woman says she's beaten by her boyfriend. And, this is bad. So eventually she's able to break up with that person, the man that beats her, the man that cheats on her. She's able to distance herself from him. And her friends come in and tell her this is wrong. Now, in the meantime, she's looking for definitions of why this has happened. And let's say it's the first time. It's her first real relationship. The guy beats her, cheats on her, degrades her. Okay, all these things that society agrees are wrong, right? Now, because she looks at the why, what's wrong with this, she starts to build rules and definitions of how this is a bad thing. Okay? Now, in that, she then decides to attempt dating again. She attempts to date again, but in this case, she lives by these rules and definitions. She tells everybody that she dates, about what her boundaries are, who she is, but she hasn't really worked on herself, which is common. This is, again, part of the process. This is the part of victimhood that you got to realize. It's very easy to be naive to many aspects of it because it's a complex thing and there's no real guide or rule book to it. And even in this, where I'm proposing a guide to it, it's very hard to follow. So much choice that comes into play that keeps you from following it. So she decides to date these people, but she gets bored with them because they're living by her boundaries and her rules. She doesn't like them because that's difficult. It's difficult to take something that you learn to like, even though you just had one major relationship, and it's even worse if you've had multiple, but where one person that you like and you've built this definition of what it is you enjoy in a relationship that's very hard to articulate, because remember, when we're being abused, when we look back on being abused, and these things that are hard to articulate, well, sex is very hard to articulate. And emotions and connection is very hard to articulate, but we try and live by these definitions. It doesn't fully fulfill us, so she gets bored with the guy. She breaks up with that guy, or he breaks up with her. Maybe she's so crazy that it just doesn't fit. Whatever it is. So she meets another guy and she lays down his boundaries, and she kind of likes this guy, and he has a little bit more of an edge to him. And he agrees to those boundaries. No, man. If you ever touch me, I don't put up with shit. If you yell at me, if you raise your voice in the wrong way, I'm gone. Absolutely. Strong woman. I'm attracted to that. That's what he says. They go about it, and he ends up abusing her. And and this could happen in multiple ways. Sometimes women may attract men or choose men that just straight up cross the line and abuse them because they want to. And there's other times where women start fights with men. And they start fights with men and they lose. And we didn't really cover this earlier on, but it was in one of the slides, is that when the difference between abuse and a fight is that abuse means that somebody says stop and then it continues. Or there's a known disadvantage and that person just exploits it, knowing they exploit it. Even though the person isn't losing all the time, it gets to a point where they know they're going to lose. And, there could be a certain joy from that and so on. And so in all of this, she has chosen a man because she hasn't worked on herself who is abusive. He has abused her and hurt her. Say he's cheated on her and beat her again. They're both wrong. Socially, we can all agree that he has committed the greater crime. I'm not here to argue that. But if she does not fix the things within her, then she is wrong. If she's also starting fights, creating more of the abuse when it's not there, because not all men enter into relationships and just want to hurt somebody. It's learned. And it might be learned from their parents. It might be learned from other people. But they need to find that person that can stoke it. And that does happen. Now, again, this doesn't excuse the crime of the man and what he's done. But for the woman, in order for her to heal, she needs to accept responsibility of her part in this, which that's part of that tough pill to swallow. But we're not done swallowing that pill. Let's look at the male example, which might be more relevant to you. Many women lie to men. Many women cheat on men. Many women psychologically belittle men. And so let's say a man has been cheated on, screwed over, he gets a divorce, he gets humiliated, he gets destroyed, gets ripped off, he loses his job, he loses his reputation, he gets thrown in jail. Everything goes wrong for this guy. And in all of this, he searches for meaning. And he goes online, he asks his friends. His friends are like, oh man, fuck that. Women are crazy. Women are crazy. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. But he finds all this stuff online and it says, man, women are sociopaths or women have more borderline. Oh man, you look at borderline and what the qualities are, which if you really look and study borderline without your emotions invested in it, it's a very broad. There's a lot wrong with this. And again, I'm not a psychologist. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of it and studying it is there's a space between being bipolar and being schizophrenic. And everything in between that, which is a pretty big gap, is borderline. Now, it does have definitions and traits that are a part of it, but it's very intense and a lot of gray area in it of what it could be, but extremely intense. He starts looking at the psychological definitions of that, stories about it. Oh my God, stories that, maybe are written by somebody who's gotten a psychological assessment, maybe not. But it's just crazy. It's crazy. You go, oh my God, this is terrible. This is terrible. Fuck, how did I deal with this? How did I get caught up with this horrible, horrible thing? So men go, man, there's a problem. I see the definition of the problem. I'm going to look at how to avoid that problem. I'm going to, build a life not around that. And maybe I'm going to date again. Maybe I'm not. But they haven't fixed and they haven't looked at why that woman liked them. They haven't looked at why they liked that woman. They think that because, she was a narcissist or a psychopath or whatever she is, that she's a convincing liar. This is one of the traits. They're convincing liars. Well, what we don't look at is maybe she lied to you because she was afraid and whatever. I mean, people lie all the time, but she had sex with us and orgasm. She had my kids. She said that day after day. She carried on this affair. She was a convincing liar. This must be the same as a narcissist. And what a narcissist would do in this situation, or a Machiavellian or a psychopath or a sociopath would do in this situation, is they would enjoy it and they would torture and they prey off of people and they seek out smarter people. They seek more, isn't that convenient? They seek out intelligent, successful people because it's a game. They want people who have this, that, and the other thing. And it's kind of like a compliment to us that we have no responsibility. And what you would know if you did go to a psychologist, psychiatrist, or therapist who specialized in this is that, of course, they pre-select people or people who are preying on individuals like it. But what are they preying on? It's not just because you're smart and you're easy to be lied to. It's because you have problems. Whereas if you were to fix those certain, or let's not call them problems, you have characteristics that are very attractive to that person. But if you fixed those, you couldn't have a relationship with those people. Interesting. Because that is, if we are, a lot of times these guys will, quote science or the DSM or so on, different psychological, cherry-picked quotes. But the overall consensus, if you've had at least one relationship with this person, there's something about you, probably a lot about you, that made it work. This is part of that tough pill. You created it. Like many women who are in abusive relationships start fights, and many women also don't. They just get abused. But there's a part of them that picked it. Just like with you, you may have been attracted to her, but I'll tell you this, she was definitely attracted to you. Fix those things. You have to, or else you're just going to have it happen again. And not just that you might have it happen again, it's very likely that you will have it happen again. That's terrible. Terrible. And you can see if you don't fix those things, it's very easy to go MGTOW, to deprive yourself of sex. And that, may be a great choice for you. But to not have this component of femininity that it so aligns with us is amazing. It's amazing that we would override that part of our evolution, our drivers within us, and to not think that affects other drivers too, meaning our sexual drivers, that we could override those because we haven't dealt with our pain. Strength cannot come from that. Now, I wanted to talk about this victim mindset with different communities of men because it's so prevalent. And we did touch on this. We touched on the PUA communities, the pickup artist communities, the red pill, the MGTOW, and in the incels. And I think with the incels, they're so far gone that you almost don't want to address them. But of course, if you want help, there's help out there. But part of the things about this that are so important is these communities are really built on men finding an answer for themselves. Yet when we look at the answer, we do see people, and again, I don't know a ton of people in the red pill, but some of the higher end figures that do have relationships with people, you don't hear stories of trauma. And you don't hear stories of dealing with trauma coming from them. You hear inconveniences, you hear problems. And again, trauma, you can't really link to a specific action. But if you did want to get dramatic in a specific action triggering trauma, I could list off a lot of the stuff that I've heard very common from people who are drug addicts. You experience major, like horrific trauma. Things that you can't really make up. But sexual assaults, physical assaults that are usually repetitious, that are from different people that are just horrible and hard to live with. Watching your friends die, just different things that are on a level that is very intense and hard to understand. So hard to understand that to articulate them would have people judge you, so you can't express them, so you can't find your group that can love and accept you, and so on. I never hear stuff like that from guys who are functional red pill men. I'm open to being wrong on this, and that's really not the point. The point is that it's rare for people to buy into these communities and get healthy. We look at pickup. How many of those guys made it into a relationship without moving outside of pickup and working on themselves, especially the guys that were fully into it? Like myself. I had to move away from it, work very hard on myself, and I am a rarity in that industry to be able to have a wife and a family and be responsible in these ways, and even to have a business that isn't dependent upon sensationalized guarantees and stuff like that. Even more rare is to have a huge group of men that broadcast and share the same message of it working for themselves. But then we get into things like the red pill, which is a broader topic. And I was listening to something that David Tien had done, and he said he didn't want to comment on the red pill, but he noticed a certain theme because there wasn't a solid definition of what the red pill is, because it's very broad. But one of the things about it is we hear a huge emphasis on victimhood coming from men, of having a problem that is almost an excuse of why they are the way they are. But the result of that, which pinpoints it even more, is that it comes from it comes to the result of we're going to have relationships with women by control and by fearing the reality of what can happen. And of course, being smarter and thinking of very male-oriented trait ways of science, systems, and things to make things work. We saw this very same thing in pickup. I mean, the two things are so identical. Whenever I look at red pill material on dating, it looks like PUA material circa 2006. I don't think there's much of a difference between that and the game, even though they say they're different from PUAs. That it's a system, it's detached, it doesn't require emotion, it requires a certain level of control, it requires power, it requires a lot based on social proof, although it may be called something else, yet we're different than pickup artists. What you get from different groups like myself, or Hans Komains, or Zan Perions, is that a lot has to deal with emotion, choice, allowance, wisdom of when to be strong, wisdom of when to use your anger or not, what power is when it comes to sex, allowing the female's power to come in. But it's a very key when you talk to people that have stepped away from pickup in those groups, or never gotten into the red pill or MGTOW or so on. But you just don't see results of men bettering themselves. It's incomplete. And that is crazy to me. And when you see men who have been traumatized, you almost never see them heal from it. And specifically, once again, healing from it would mean that they have experienced a level of trauma and they are able to not see themselves as victims anymore. I mean, there's been plenty of things that I could be considered victimized. So I don't even use the word for myself, but I did need to for years to wrap my head around it. I don't consider it being victimized. I mean, thousands upon thousands of dollars. It's probably like $150,000+ I've been taking for a ride with women. My kids, not seeing them for 5 years. Being what I would consider falsely accused of abuse, being put in jail. Also, and other things when it comes to drug addiction, sexual abuse, sexual assault, being beaten, being damaged, seeing my friends die, all this sort of stuff, like over and over again in my life, does not make me a victim. Any of that anymore. Now, I did for a little while to wrap my head around it and to work very hard at it. But I do not see it as that. I do not see the same thing coming from any of those communities of people saying that, one, they're not a victim, who have been victimized, who've seen abuse. Two, I don't see them having relationships with people or women that don't require fear and power over somebody. In order to have a relationship with people, what I see is you can't be hurt again because this person is dangerous. They can only have so much choice. And once I set these boundaries and once I have the power, then I can allow them to express. This is such an abnormal thought to even think that that is an answer. And I've thought that that was the answer, coming from the society and culture that we come from. But to see this in human history is ridiculous. People only think it when, one, we can have a society sustainable enough to have that sort of thought and philosophy be built, which has plenty of great benefits, but also when they've been victimized, when they've been disempowered, when we see pain coming from not having the power. We seek the opposite of that pain to build ourselves. That's another thing which you'll hear over and over again in the different presentations or videos that we do, is pain shows us where the problem is, but it does not show us the solution. We seek the opposite. We seek the opposite of our pain, thinking that's the answer, but we're really led astray. And in this case, we think women are the problem. Women need to be controlled. That if we have that hurt again, we can't live. If we don't do anything about it, man, we're screwed. We're demolished. We're less of a man. We're a cuck. We're a beta. We're all this sort of stuff. Man, it's so crazy. When the great irony of this is what made you want to fight against being a cuck was probably that you were one. That's what's so nuts. So Crazy. And what's wrong with that? Man, I, being a very sexually motivated person, have been in relationships where all that sort of stuff has happened. And it's kind of cool. It's very different than representing something that would be humiliating at the deepest level. It's part of that weakness. Men, you're supposed to be broken. You're supposed to be hurt. You're supposed to have confusing points in your life. That's what's going to give you your strength. It shouldn't give you your fear. And it shouldn't make you see the world as an object, especially sex. All right, so healing from abuse, starting as a victim, we need to start to become empowered and know that we need to move away from that. So in that, victimization is key. We need to understand that we are victims, but we also need to start seeing that this is all ours to deal with. So there's a couple traits of a person that moves with this healthy that you never see. You never see this in those communities, in pickup, in the red pill, in MGTOW, and incels, to get to this point where we can move past it. There's all different types of victims, and we get there in all sorts of different ways. We can't put our finger on just what makes somebody a victim by the result. It could be having your heart broken. It could be being bit by a snake. This is something, a friend of mine, he was bit by a snake early on in his life. It wasn't poisonous, but after that, he had never feared snakes before that. Now he fears it in a big way. Obviously, there's a different, fear of snakes and so on that come without being bitten. Drowning, that's another one. You could almost drown. If you don't get back in the water right away, you might never get back in the water. It was actually the true story of mine when, I forget how old I was, but this was amazing. There was something called the Toilet Bowl in Hawaii at Hanauma Bay, which is now closed. They don't allow people to go there, but I got sucked into it and I just put my hand up. I don't know how bad it was, but I was getting sucked out of this crazy thing. It's like a siphon. It's really fun. I grabbed on and I was able to hold on to all this water sucking me out, and I didn't get washed out to the ocean and drown. But the fear of God was in me. I was so afraid. And I was told, stay in the water, get back in the water, get in safety, get out of the toilet bowl. And it's literally like a toilet bowl. It's a lot of fun. I'm sad it's closed. I wish I could hike out and sneak into it. Maybe I will one of these days, but they closed it off. But get back in the water or else you'll never get back in. Being attacked, being assaulted, these are the ones that create a lot of trauma. But there's a couple things that happen when we feel this pain. Okay, so when we feel this pain, whether we're drowning, we're bit by a snake, we've been abused by a woman, we've been taken for a ride, never-ending pain constantly happening while we're in it, triggering all these hormones and things in our brain. It's crazy, but things which there were no shortage of in the history of man. So if we experience trauma in a socially healthy culture, which we do not have right now, there are plenty of things which are healthy, but they're not really made for trauma, and we see reactions to trauma going up and different mental disorders going up, is that we have a place. Everybody sees us, and so we hear about this in tribal cultures, or you might hear about this in, religious cultures like Seventh-day Adventist groups or Mormon groups that are very tight-knit. And of course, those things may have their own problems, but we do see examples of where people go through a lot of pain and they're able to work through it. So perhaps there's a death in the family. Somebody, might lose a pregnancy. Somebody might die in a birth or whatever it is. There's these huge points of trauma, but they're able to be absorbed back in the community in a different way, because that abstract feeling that you're not able to articulate, that you're not able to put your finger on, trauma, because you only feel it a few points. You can't build points of references to it. And why would you want to? Don't do that. It has a place where that feeling can come out. You're changed by it, but it doesn't haunt you. Okay, and this is a trait that we see in just lesser stimuli cultures. Okay, now, in cultures where we can't talk about it, let's say you're abused or tortured or hurt, can't really find an outlet for it. The thing is that you isolate and you alienate. Anything which is psychologically taxing on you, alienation and isolation is going to accentuate that. Okay, so if you do develop a disorder, if you do get PTSD from it, isolation and alienation, which is a symptom of PTSD, so it's kind of like this vicious circle, it's going to intensify that. Okay, and so that's why so much PTSD healing comes from groups and one-on-one coaching and a lot of working it out, with your psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, and so on. Your people, very, very important. But then we get into a fear-based trauma culture. And so this is stuff that you see on those MGTOW boards, or you see in a lot of men's rights stuff. Not that their primary purpose is that, but we see this emphasis on fear. You know, if you don't take the red pill, I know it's a tough pill to swallow, Steve. If you don't take that, you're then in this life where you've eaten the blue pill and you're walking around like a lame person, believing everything, you just get screwed. And you deserve it now because you're not one of us. Like all this crazy stuff. Now again, there's a lot of diversity to it. And there's a lot of stuff that all these groups say that is right, that is correct, factually, or even when it comes to opinion. But that fear, when we've had some sort of abuse, it keeps us in it. It doesn't allow us to transition. Now, there's also trauma when we have groups or when we have people that can accept us. So here's the thing. If we were in a socially healthy culture, we wouldn't need that. But because most of us aren't, and there's so much fear-based stuff, there's so much isolation and judgment that's been put on, years of suppressing that trauma, that a group in guidance is massively, it's just necessary in it. And so what I want to look at are the traits of those groups, the traits of healing, the things that you do not see in these pickup groups that you need to transition out of so that you can deal with this sort of pain and trauma. These things that when you get bad things that happen in your life that you're guaranteed to have continuously for the rest of your life, whether or not you're MGTOW, it's going to happen to you financially. Or if you do have enough control with the red pill and your women are just slaves to you, or whatever it is you want and your motivation is, you might have an accident. You're going to have pain. You're going to have stuff which is confusing, you don't know how to deal with, and it's extremely taxing on you. So how do you deal with it? Number one, which I also never see from these groups, is you stop blaming the abuser. You stop analyzing the abuser. So if you've dated a psychopath or a sociopath or whatever, you're still in that victim mindset. You might need it for a little while, but at some point it has to stop. You continuing that, learning to research it, why it's there, is just basically punching the time card of your fear and your weakness. And when you're hurt, you need to be weak. If you're in a fight and you get hurt, this is something that happens to me all the time in jiu-jitsu. You know, my arms get popped or my ankle gets popped. I need time off. I need to not fight. That doesn't make me less of a jiu-jitsu player or a man or whatever. That makes me listen to my body. My body forces me to do it. I'm supposed to be hurt. I'm supposed to be weak so that I don't continue to do that. Maybe, I might overdo it sometimes. You guys get it. I got my own issues with my love and passion for the combat martial arts. But you get hurt. You can't compete. You get hurt, you can't fight. You got to fight on a limited level. When you're abused by somebody and you've been hurt and you've been beaten down and you've been damaged, you have to stop. You're supposed to be weak for a little bit. You're supposed to blame. You're supposed to sit on your butt and be taken out of the game. Life kicked your ass. But if you continue there, you stay on the bench. You have to be able to get up. And part of getting up is the second trait of taking personal responsibility. This is all mine. Now, let's say my parents abused me. I had no say in it. I got just beaten for no reason every day. What's my part in that? I have a huge part in that. The huge part that says that I don't have to deal with that. I'm in denial about it and it's not going to affect me. So it does still affect me at a deeper level. Or it could be that I carry around that resentment, constantly making that an excuse for myself. So for instance, an example might be, let's say I didn't do anything to my ex-wife. She just robbed me in court and she was just vindictive and evil. And by the end of it, I was like the good guy and she was just the bad person. Okay, the fact that you're still telling that story is your part. The fact that you still think that matters in any aspect of your life is your part. That should affect you for the rest of your life. But if you start off by saying that's why it affects you, you can't become who you need to be. And if you don't understand that, you need to stop talking about it. You need to stop talking your trash and start coming from a point of only personal responsibility. It's going to be very, very, very difficult. And that's why you have the third part, and that's outside perspectives. You need therapy. You need a group. You need one or the other. You might need all of them. Like in our groups, like I say, we don't replace psychologists or psychology or mental health professionals. You might need that. Some guys only come to our groups and get better. Other guys work with a therapist or a psychologist or psychiatrist or a social worker or somebody else in tandem with our groups. It's not about either or whatever. It's the fact that you're working with people to get an outside perspective. Why do you need an outside perspective? There's a couple reasons for it. You won't know where you're off. Guys who have been there before will be able to tell you. You may not know how to articulate your pain. You need to hear other people's story in pain and perhaps healing in order to get it. Also, a group, which is so important. Now, this is not the same with a psychologist or a therapist because they're one-on-one, but in a group, it's good, like our groups, are very established. They're old. They're 10 years old. So for a decade, we've had unbroken chains of groups of men talking and working and living a better life. You know, all from this template. In that, there's people who have done more than you. They've gotten to the end of the tunnel. They become great. They've gotten into their power. There's also people right where you're at. Whether they've been in for 2 years, 1 year, whatever. You can't put a timeline on pain. But there's people right where you're at. And if you stick around long enough, you're going to see people that are the same as you. Or that were the same as you. That are less. They're starting out. They're new on the journey. That's very, very important. Okay, so you're going to see that. It's pretty cool. So what's also important for that is within a group, you're going to see growth in yourself because growth in this way happens so slow. It happens so slow that you'll never see it, but you'll see it from somebody else. Now, if you are going to a psychologist or psychiatrist and you go on that one-on-one route of therapy, which is great, I'm not against it. And you can do both too. But if you just feel more comfortable talking to one person, you should be of service in some way so that you can understand where you came from. You're going to see it. And I have some opinions on service, to be selfless, to not do it for fame or glory or guilt or whatever, topic for another webinar and so on. But service is very key to being able to understand and talk to people who've been in your shoes. So just to repeat that, traits of strong men who've gained strength that are so vital to this, that I see as absolutes. And of course, through experience, through helping men prove me wrong, and let's build a dialogue of this, stop focusing on the abuse, gain personal responsibility, and get an outside perspective. Work on those three things devoutly. They're not just words. They're not just empty definitions. Live them, and you're going to be better off than you could ever imagine. In some ways for me, and many ways for me, straight up, I do not consider myself successful in any areas of my life without this pain. I am grateful, truly grateful. I may not want to go through it again, but of the beatings, the losses, of the true trauma that I've had, the confusion of multiple years compounded that I didn't know how to answer for a decade of my life, that caused me enough pain to stop blaming, to take personal responsibility, and to seek out groups and then create groups where this happens. Guys, if you want help in your life, you need to own your life. You can't do that if you're obsessed with where your pain comes from. In life, you're going to experience pain. You're going to be confused by money, by sex, by relationships, by power, by your goals, your dreams, your ambitions, your purpose are going to give you pain. They are going to help cause some of the worst things in your life. You have to know how to handle it. You have to know that you cannot be strong. You cannot be great without taking pain straight on and learning how to deal with it. This is my way of doing it. This is not the only way. But like I said, there's a lot of examples where it's not happening, where I don't see healthy men getting there. Men's development, let alone even this whole psychological phenomenon of understanding pain and trauma and dealing with it is very new. PTSD and what that did to people in the 90s, we didn't know. And we knew what being shell-shocked was from Vietnam and so on, but we did not understand what those things were until maybe the early thousands. In 2008, 2009, did we start to get a grip of what might cause these things and how this happened. This is very, very new. We're just scraping the surface. Just remember, guys, to live, to have personal strength, It is absolutely dependent upon how you live life on life's terms in the world around you, not controlling life to fit your needs. That is what a man who is sold on his fear does. That characteristics of that would be obsession with control, judgment, an endless desire to need power over others or things in order to be happy. That if you're seeking that as a man, you have not truly listened to your pain. You will never find your strength. And in order to find your power, which is a gift, an absolute gift that you should live by, you have to come to terms with your pain, with your trauma, get over it. Men, this is obviously a big discussion. If you've watched this whole thing, I really appreciate it. You can download all the slides or anything else that we added to it in the free stuff link down below. But more importantly, you can join our free groups like Austin Men's Development. But if you live in Austin, we have live meetups every Thursday, and that's part of our paid groups. We also have MD Excellence for if you live internationally. You have a 24-hour support. You can get access to anybody, any time of the day through our online forums, which are extremely active, full of men who have achieved excellence from pain. And of course, there's other variations of man's journey than just pain, but that is a huge one. You don't have to stay a victim. You can live through any pain in your life and become great, become excellent. And in fact, you can't become excellent unless you have learned to process that gift from the world to you that we see as confusion, pain, and trauma. And dealing with that is truly the road to being your best. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you guys soon.